Our concluding speaker for this afternoon is Brett Purdy. He's with Alberta Innovates. He's going to speak about Alberta Innovates Water Innovation Program, R&D supporting water use, watershed management, and climate adaptation in Alberta. Brett is Executive Director of Environmental Innovation in the Clean Resources Division at Alberta Innovates. In this position, Brett works with a talented team responsible for supporting research and innovation in the areas of integrated land management, restoration, and reclamation, including oil sands tailings, climate adaptation, and sustainable water resource management. Before his positions within AI, Brett worked in government and academic institutions as a reclamation research scientist, collaborating with others in academia, government, and industry to facilitate implementation of applied reclamation research programs and policy development. Brett has conducted research in reclamation, forestry ecology, conservation biology, and population genetics, and taught university courses in forestry and conservation. Brett has a PhD in botany from the University of Alberta and a BSc in biology from the University of Calgary. Brett.
All right. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Certainly always pleasure to listen and learn and then sort of cap off the day to be able to share results from some of the work that we do. I actually was thinking of starting off with a slide that either had a picture of Dr. Bunsen Honeydew or Beaker, because honestly, after reading out things that on the one hand on paper we can put that we do, your average workday sometimes feels a little bit more like the Muppet Show. So having said that, it's just a chance that I get to stand up here and I'll recognize some history in the room here. Had David Hill not left Alberta Innovates back in 2012, he'd be standing up here giving that talk. So for that, David, thanks for coming back to Lethbridge and giving me the opportunity to come in here, because honestly, working with AI has been one of the most rewarding parts for my career since I've been working either in government or academia. So I thought I'd start off with being a little bit innovative, and after listening to that really great talk that Dr. Charlebois gave, I didn't realize you could talk in such an animated and informative way with a box of Timbit cereal in front. So I just picked up something I've used before, like who knew? Things that you can do. Sometimes, marketing, we've got a real lost opportunity. So I'm giving a talk about water. But apparently you can market water as being diet water. It's been tried. Here's just a picture of diet water being sold by Sapporo in Japan back in the mid-2000s. Kind of strange, as I always figured water had 0 calories, 0 fat, 0 carbs, 0 protein, so you didn't have to market it as such. But they managed to put it in some plastic bottles and people bought it over the course of a decade. But sadly, it's not being sold anymore, so maybe it's not such a good marketing opportunity. So I'd like to back up a little bit before I talk about our water innovation program and say a few things about Alberta Innovates. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, and for those of you who are, because we've gone through some changes in particular in the last year, but really since 2016, since we merged 4 corporations together to form a single corporation. So we're the largest provincial corporation that conducts research and innovation for any province in Canada. We still are, even though we've gone through some changes in November and December this year. Here's just a map indicates 2 things. One, where we have some offices. We've got 10 locations across the province where we house some of our staff. We've got 500 staff in these 10 locations, including here in Lethbridge. But the majority of the people are in our Edmonton office at the Millwoods facility, which is the formerly owned by Alberta Research Council, and then out at Vegreville, where we have both water research and ag research that's conducted principally out there, as well as some work that supports the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. So 500 staff distributed across the province, invest right now an annual budget of $200 and some million. Some of that's reflected in revenue that we bring in and that we spend, and some of that's reflected in money that government gives to us that we then invest in R&D across the province. So with that, I'm in what's called the Clean Resources Group right now. So across the top, I've got a few little icons for those that can see. You can read what they represent. For those that can't, it represents a clean energy division that's focused on investing historically largely in oil and gas, but also in clean tech that includes renewables, bioenergy, and more recently on carbon capture utilization and thinking about hydrogen as an economy in the province. Biosector that was focused on principally agriculture, forestry, sort of the main supply chains as well as the waste associated with it. We invest in health innovation, and we support, in particular, small and medium enterprise business in either business development or innovation in terms of product development across the province. And then we have two subsidiaries, Innotech. You might have known them before as Alberta Innovates Tech Futures, or you might have known them before that as the Alberta Research Council. And then C4 Technologies, which is largely focused on certification and product testing in the oil and gas industry. I stand up here principally as somebody who worked in the clean energy group before and managed largely the environmental innovation portfolio. So I've identified that on your left here is land and biodiversity and water innovation, but we've got investments in clean technology, advanced hydrocarbons. We elected a new government. We've gone through some austerity measures. We've gone through our own austerity measures, and over the course of the last year, we've reduced our staff profile from over 600 to just above 500, and we've reduced our investment portfolio as well. But in doing so, we've gone through a process where we're merging with what was our biosector in the past, which includes investments in smart ag and food innovation. So that's led by Cornelia Kreplin and her group housed out of Edmonton, sustainable bioindustrial materials that's focused on forestry and ag, often in some cases looking at value added, but taking also waste from the product processing and looking at other opportunities there. And then also investments, broadly speaking, in greenhouse gas mitigation. For those of you that know us well, you'll say, what the hell happened in November? Because we lost Steve Price, the VP for our biosector. We lost Pat Gydra, the executive director, the director that we had for the bioindustrial areas. We lost Carol Bitak, who worked in EGS, Ecological Goods and Services, and had all kinds of connections to the agriculture and the food community in the province. And we also lost Christine Murray, who had an office here across the river at the University of Lethbridge and focused on our support in food innovation. So we haven't walked away from all this. We lost 4 really good people. One or two of them stuck their hand up and said, I'm willing to go now, I'm ready to retire, and a couple others were just part of our reduction. But I'd like to say we're still investing in the agricultural community, water research innovation in the southern part of the province, and the group that I'm in is now responsible for that as well. And I'm in the process of learning more about some of the work we do in this area outside of our investments in water. Little bit of buzzword bingo. Like a lot of other sectors in the province, we're now investing in digital and all things digital. And so it's been a real theme for our new CEO who comes from working in that sector in other parts of the world. And so our 4 platforms that we're looking at, aside from investing in the main areas of Alberta's strengths, whether it's oil and gas, agriculture, forestry, that history of exploitation and value add to our natural resource industry, is to say, what can we bring from a data-enabled innovation in here? And so whether it's issues like looking at the opportunities from artificial intelligence, machine learning, some of the analytics, building on digital technology that's thinking about the role that geospatial software and Internet of Things can play, looking at, broadly speaking, clean technology, which includes whether it's water, climate, smart grid, and agriculture, and lastly, innovative product production and distribution, which is largely focused on value add, as we're looking at opportunities in that area as well, across all the sectors that we make investments in. We actually just, for the very first time, we've always been very sector focused. We've put opportunities out there for people to apply to us for funding to advance technologies in very specific sectors. It's the first time we just threw one out and said, we're just interested in digital innovation and clean energy. Here's, broadly speaking, everything from production, from the production side, the processing side, water, land, biodiversity, remote sensing. Can you come and address some problems in the areas, but we're really focused on the digital part of innovation. We put $3 million in funding was available, up to $200,000 per project. Just went through our reviews last week. We've got a series of recommendations that are going to one of our VPs for decisions. Glad to say there's a couple water ones in there, and I think if we were having this on Friday, I'd be able to highlight a couple things a little later on that are good news stories for investments here, but it's not Friday. So All right, we'll move on. So I'd just like to point out, busy slide, there's a number of icons in here. I'd like to focus attention to specifically that all of our investments have to have a line of sight to moving the dial on one of a number of key problems in Alberta, whether it's technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, technologies that reduce freshwater use in either, in particular in the oil and gas sector, if we can look at approaches that really support, broadly speaking, water for life. And so that's just one of these icons here that's got a green star next to it. So on the water sector side, asking questions about, are you supporting innovation that provides a better understanding and support for reliable water supplies for a growing economy? Are you doing things that support safe, secure drinking water? Are you doing things that support aquatic ecosystem health, while also doing things very specifically about economic growth and job creation? So having said that, just to step a little bit into water, a couple stories that I know people in here already know. Alberta is not unique in terms of its water challenges. We can go through this list and you can find another jurisdiction share these challenges, whether it's crossing borders with other provinces in Canada, moving down the eastern slopes to a number of places in the States, or crossing the continents elsewhere. And so while we're not unique in these challenges, it means we can also think of them in terms of opportunities. We can import great ideas from elsewhere in the world. We can also create those great ideas in this province and then export them to the elsewhere in the world. So while these are challenges we have to deal with, they're also opportunities, and that's where innovation comes into play. So I'd like to touch on just a couple things. Again, something in this room, people in this room already know. A map on the left indicates just where's all the water in the province. Certainly it's in the north. Where do all the people live, and where's the major parts of the water use? That's in the south. And so a graph that actually comes from some work. So Monterey was up here at 1 o'clock and gave a presentation on some of their work. So just a graph that came from some of their analysis early on when they were looking not at the water demand side, where they're building models now, but on the water supply side, where is that related to water demand? And we can see from this graph on your right that most of the water use, of course, is in the south. We can take largely out of the SSRB, whether it's the Oldman or the Bow, and you step back to the next one being the Athabasca. So I'd ask the question then, where are we likely to see the key innovation in the province if related to that water use? And so not surprisingly, I get a chance to sit on the Water Council with a few other people that are in the audience here, including Margot, who gets to open this up and represent the irrigation districts. You know, what drives innovation? And certainly, you know, limiting supplies is certainly in that case. And so for all the water sectors that report back to the Water Council how they've changed their practices to voluntary either increase conservation or increase efficiency and productivity for the water that they use, and therefore provide lines of sight to conservation of water. Irrigation and oil and gas are the two sectors that are absolutely leading the pace here, and remarkable improvements since 2005 for sure for the irrigation sector in terms of total water consumed, how much is return flow, and very specifically analytics that relate to productivity and efficiency related to that water use. And so largely through commercial implementation and development of a number of technologies on farms. Same can be said for the oil and gas. And then I'd just like to point out, we certainly understand that the past is always not the best predictor of the present, and it certainly won't predict the future. And so just some great work, including that led by researchers right here in the University of Lethbridge. So Stefan Kinzel, Stuart Rood, Larry Flanagan, and more recently the addition Chris Hopkinson to the group. And just a graph that we pulled out of the Canadian Climate Change Report for 2019. And so, work that's understood and familiar to people who either have to understand water delivery and or water use in the province. And so a graph that just indicates from the past, the line in the red, and sort of the present and or anticipated future water supplies, the line in the green on the graph over the course of the year. And we can see there's, the area on the graph might not change, but the time of the year that water is delivered and how people can access it is obviously shifted. And so this was some great work that started in the province, led by Stefan Kinzel and Stu Root, and it's now, being used at a Canadian level to understand how we can sort of manage infrastructure in the economy and the industry to prepare for and for changing water supplies in the future. So I was here to talk about the Water Innovation Program, so that was my introduction. So just want to say a few things about investments that we've made into the Water Innovation Program that has a history that goes back to the Alberta Water Research Institute. And so to date, over 100 projects that we've invested over $60 million in since originally standing our organization up in 2008 with investments directly in water. Two key areas we look at making those investments in terms of moving the dial, of being able to look out a window and say, how have we changed the way Alberta operates in better space? And so, you know, projects that look at efficiency, productivity of use of water, or also to look at it a different way in places when we take it from a more landscape perspective. Are we improving our, reducing the footprint that we have on the landscape? So our investments, we manage in 4 different themes, either projects that are in future water supply, watershed management, aquatic ecosystem health, either technology or knowledge that advances conservation, efficiency, and productivity use of water, and then lastly about water quality protection. So technologies and or some policies that touch on drinking water and wastewater treatment systems, and or managing pollutants in the landscape. So with that, I just wanted to give a really high-level overview of some of the projects that we've invested in, maybe some of the key messages where we've seen projects that have resulted in, or we anticipate them to result in changes, whether it's in operational practices, best practices, or technology applications that are now being commercial and are creating job creation and economic growth in the province. So I'd like to start just at the biggest scale and ask the questions about climate, land use, land cover disturbance, source water protection, and resilience. And so we've managed to have, over the course of a number of years now, 4 really great research teams that we've invested in that are looking at these landscape level impacts, tying climate, weather, land cover and land use down into understanding water quality and water quantity issues that are available in terms of a demand perspective. And so I'm just going to go through a couple pictures and tell a few stories here. So at the very top left, mountain climate and hydrology, so work that's led through the Global Water Futures program, led by John Pomeroy out of the University of Saskatchewan, hydrologists from Waterloo like Rich Petrone, and then touch on some key team members that are in Alberta like Misaki Hayashi from the University of Calgary in terms of groundwater. And so, you know, that work is largely focused on the Bow River system, building some models that allow us to better understand that intersection of climate, weather, and water supply. And so building models that then Alberta Environment can use to sort of manage from a river forecasting perspective to you know, both manage the infrastructure and then manage the decision makings from a water use, water demand perspective over the course of the year. So lower left, forest disturbance and water quality, led by Elda Sillins and Monica Melko out of University of Alberta. And Waterloo, where Monica comes from, so the Southern Rockies Watershed projects. And so this is really a flagship initiative. There's probably only one or two other places in the planets where there's such a rich data set of 20 years worth of mountain hydrology data that's linking weather, forest cover, forest disturbance to looking at water quality issues. And so what started out as work that was largely grew out of the Lost Creek Fire in the Upper Oldman in 2003 has continued on to expand into looking at, now that they have a great understanding of the impacts of fire and water quality in the eastern slopes, to ask the questions about impacts of forest harvesting. And I know Chris, one of Aldis's, his research assistant, probably stood up here, was it last year? Was it here last year or in Calgary? In Calgary. Stood almost here, but in Calgary at the same podium there, speaking to that project. And I got a couple things to say about it just because they handed in their final report last night, so that's what I was reading and making a couple slides about. Upper right, a project led by Chris Hopkinson that includes Stu Rood, Stefan Kinzel, and Larry Flanagan, looking at land use and land cover change. And this started out of work that focused on leveraging some opportunities with some change in land use with the establishment of protection in the Castle area, but really, again, taking a very different modeling approach to what John Pomeroy was leading out of the Global Water Futures project, to say, we're not going to get that much data at that fine a scale. We need to grow this project out and build some models that are based on a coarser scale of data to provide information on water supply. And so some really good work that's led from there. And lastly, in the lower right, work that Monica Melko has been leading, that we leveraged out of the Fort McMurray fire. So put a big fire right on top of a big city in northern Alberta. And two things happened. One, research team that immediately got mobilized that was really critical to keep that drinking water system up and running, which was really important for fighting fires in that town during the fire in Fort McMurray. But since that time, just the impact, the understanding that came out of the work that was in the Southern Rockies that's now grown to also occur in other parts of the province, the importance in understanding the change in water supply post-fire to provide a critical resource like drinking water is so important. And just so you know, like the engineer who manages this facility, so lower right in Fort McMurray, just the increased cost to manage that in that town site post-fire has now gone over $1 million of additional chemicals just to address issues of organics that come flush out of the landscape after fire. And I think we all know that fire might be increasing a little bit in our forested landscape, so we can ask questions, are there other ways we can manage the forest to reduce those impacts in the future? So I'd like to say, just to touch on some of the results from that, Southern Rockies Watershed Project asked the question, how can we manage forests to minimize risk to fire, but also manage them in the context so that we minimize risk to water quality that includes whether it's aquatic organisms or drinking water. And so, work that's come out from this project clearly identified a number of things. Long-term impacts from fire on water quality has been absolutely seen in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, manifested in the Old Man Dam from this study. On top of that, historic practices of things like post-fire, when you go in and salvage the forests, there's an added and much increased impact on water quality that's measured for a very long period of time. And so forest management branch is in the process of specifically modifying their practices in terms of salvage logging post-fire because of what we recognize is now a increased risk to water quality. And so we've got a series of pictures that are sort of post-fire in the Old Man Dam, looking at both impacts of organic material in the water, all those nutrients and how they increase the plant community and the algal community that's growing in there that then has a cascading effect on invertebrates and then fish and so on. But what's really interesting from this work is they shifted this in 2012 and started asking questions about harvesting, and in particular contemporary harvesting practices on impacts on water quality. And Chris would have certainly discussed this when he was up last year, but sort of the Coles Note story, which happened early on, continues on today to say, and it's something that I think certainly I grew up with thinking this was quite the contrary, but at least contemporary harvesting practices, when we use best practices, are almost immeasurable in terms of understanding impacts on water quality. And so there's a controversy about harvesting in the eastern slopes, and yet the reality is, from this rich work that happened in the Upper Old Man here, suggests that in fact you can do things right today, and it doesn't just have to be strip shelter wood or partial cuts. If you put your roads in properly, you roll them back, and you do the appropriate buffers around your small streams, that you actually can't measure the impact on the water quality that we previously thought was the case. And yet they can go back and look at places that were harvested in the 70s and still find some of those effects. So a good news story that changing practices today actually, there's ways of managing the forest that can reduce the forest risk, and we can still get the benefits of timber and fiber from them today. Just want to highlight a number of people, anyone who's been to any Canadian Water Resources projects here or irrigation conferences in the past, recognition of this world-class work that Stu Rood and Larry Flanagan have led specifically, and a broader team looking at functional flows that started with some work that David Hill invested with that group and some other people out of the University of Calgary in 2008. And there's not a lot of times where we have to ask the question, can we do things differently to have a better environmental outcome that you don't find there's a cost? And yet, it seems that the work that they've done, it literally shows, at times when there's sufficient water, it takes a very small amount of change in the way we operate dams for a very, very significant uptick effect in terms of improved aquatic ecosystems, whether it's the riparian forests or the in-stream flow components. And so this work is now world-class and recognized and being implemented in how to manage dams throughout Canada and throughout North America. So we're continuing to invest in this research team. So Stu's kind of retiring a little bit, but he's still leading it. Larry Flanagan's taking over more of this work as from a leader perspective. But we're asking the question of asking them to move a little bit more into, rather than the heavy data components of looking at what they're doing, can they step back and actually apply some remote sensing techniques that sort of tie into that functional flow system, but then report back on a broader data set of measures using remote sensing of recovery and risk associated with riparian communities. Just a couple slides to step away from the ag sector. We've done a lot of investments in urban water development, whether drinking water treatment system, wastewater treatment systems. And the big shift that we have today, I'd say, are really two areas. So rather than working very specifically with the big city of Calgary or EPCORs on the large scale, either drinking water treatment system sides or wastewater treatment systems, is stepping back and looking at much more decentralized, distributed, smaller systems, and in particular on the wastewater side. And so what we've seen with a couple of the pilots that we have invested in these areas is, while in a decentralized wastewater treatment system, taking either the organics out of a black water or a combined black water gray water system, moving the organics into both an anaerobic digester to produce methane, to produce heat that comes back into a small community development of one kind or another, pulling out the nitrogen, pulling out the phosphorus, recovering that and using it as fertilizer, taking that wastewater and either moving it through, we've got a few different kinds of stormwater systems that we've managed to, people that we partnered with, who are testing them, that are treating that stormwater back for release to the environment. And the cost of these treatment systems is significantly reduced. And the risk in terms of not having these long distributed pipeline systems that manage a growing population, that the long-term liability of managing decentralized systems is much less. On the technology side, just focus on swirl techs. I'll just mention technology that's being tested to enhance treatment of lagoon systems as they're used throughout the province. And really it's intended to do two things. One, to facilitate a much faster aerobic breakdown of materials, and so it's reducing nitrogen in the water, but in the process of doing this, increasing the life of lagoons, resulting in a more rapid degradation of some of the organics and the ammonia in there, actually producing a slipstream permeate of clean water that's being used for recycle purposes. And so in some communities where it's been tested, current system is out at Crossfield right now. It was up at Ponoka before, and there's another system being built right now, is really to focus on enhancing some water reuse in municipal areas, but then also basically without increasing the footprint in a lagoon system, you can increase its carrying capacity in terms of the both the biomass and the water that moves through them. And then a number of technologies, we're highlighting forward water here, but a number of technologies on oil in particular, either fracking or water flood, water treatment technologies. And so just to, again, reduce the water use in the oil and gas sector, reduce the downhole, downholing of wastewater, and increase in the water recycle. But I think there's an interesting thing coming out from the application of these technologies, and we have 5 of them in our portfolio right now that are focused on wastewater treatment in the oil and gas. And so originally 3 of them were just focused on increasing water recycle, but the reality is all 5 of them can be applied because there's a recognition that every one of these streams has a concentrated lithium stream in it. And if you certainly reading the papers about the potential for lithium recovery in the province, there's a lot of lithium in brine water that comes out of the oil and gas fields. And so any one of these technologies can be used in potentially in sequence to result in concentrated lithium that eventually could build a sort of the precursor to lithium production for battery production in the province. And then lastly, we've got a big investments both on the technology side of just absolutely changing the way we have support production of oil, heavy oil in the province, to very specific investments in a large plug-and-play water treatment test center with a number of companies up in northeastern Alberta at the Water Technology Development Center. So all these projects are arguably focused on reducing water use in the oil sands. What they also do by reducing water use is anytime you can increase the efficiency there, you're reducing the greenhouse gas footprint for production, because the majority of that footprint on production is because we're taking warm water and turning it into steam and then putting it down the hole and cleaning it again. And so the industry is really both reducing a GHG footprint and a water footprint there. And then, truly the future in heavy oil sands recovery is really moving away from water altogether. And so there's a lot of really interesting projects that are just pure solvent assisted or solvent hydrocarbon extraction using propane, butane subsurface to pull heavy oil out of the ground. So I just wanted to finish off. I always forget to look at clock, and I think I've got 20 minutes of speaking and then I take too long. But I haven't got flashed yet, so I've got a few minutes. Who's giving me the flash here? Are you, Margot? All right. So just a few recent project support relevant to the ag sector, but not all of them. And I'll say right now two things. One I forgot to say right at the start is, euphemistically, I'd say we actually don't do work. So sadly, I don't dress quite this well all the day, but I do work in an office. I still romantically think I'll get out with gumboots and a shovel, like where I started out in the future. But we actually invest in people that do the work. And so while we can tell really great stories of what we're doing from an innovation perspective across the province, it's other people that are doing that work, not us. We just get to partner and help tell that stories. And so partnerships is really important. And so with that, just highlight of a few. I know these stories have been told, but we were just lucky to partly have an application come to us that we got to go invest. And so just the critical work and focus on aquatic invasive species in the province, and the real concern in particular about its link to irrigation. And so just the incredible work that the irrigation sector has done, the educational work that the government has done in this area. So we were lucky to be able to invest with the irrigation sector and with Alberta Agriculture in specifically looking at potential techniques to mitigate against the effects of mussels once they're manifested in the province on the irrigation sector. And so the role of this report that's referenced on the right from Patterson Earth and Water, that sort of references both the results from doing some work on real field trials of applying KCl in pipe in the irrigation sector, certainly exciting results. But there was some other interesting results that came out from that too that need to be tested, and I know probably everyone here is familiar with the results there. Certainly some super cool work that started out by working with a researcher in the School of Public Health at the U of A that was just focused on understanding swimmer's itch and this parasite that lives in water, and it's got a life cycle that includes snails in the province, and how that's evolved from original work in that area to sort of building these field-based tools that can both, in a very qualitative say, but in also a quantitative way, speak to invasive species presence in the province. And so building these field kits that will identify both a measurable indicator for the presence of and the quantity of either whether it's mussels, whirling disease, cyanobacteria, swimmer's itch, and that's where the list sort of sits right now in terms of the field kit. But this work that's now built out of this lab that's now being used from a citizen science perspective, and so both partnership of Patrick Hannington's lab with the Lake Management Society, with some schools. So some of the schools are taking these kits now, and the kids go out and test for these things. And so it's really interesting, the knowledge translation piece to get people interested in a topic like trying to tell high school kids about invasive species, but you give them this cool kit that does things, new technology, they're really interested in it, and then you expose them to water and water-related issues from an educational perspective. Evan Davies certainly last year gave an update on his seasonal and operational model for water management within irrigation districts. So taking some of that reinforced learning, new analytics, and trying to roll out a more sophisticated model that supports decision-making for management of reservoirs and reservoir water levels. And so a final report from the work that they did was presented to the irrigation districts in November or December this year. I think it's been handed over. It's potentially going to be tested. We had an application back to us to say the model might be good, but there's some things that you can do for some enhancements with it. And so we've gone through our due diligence process, but We haven't made a funding decision yet on that, but I'm hoping we can tell a good story about that and work a little bit further on something to have a line of sight to say, here's another model that we helped develop that's actually making a difference to people that use water in the province to make better decisions. I wanted to say something before I go to the next slide, because Monterey asked the question when she presented. And so Monterey's work was one of the ones that we've also supported since she was recruited here after her PhD into the province, and I'm really happy that she then got recruited through a Campus Alberta Innovation Program chair to be a faculty member in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. So he asked the question, and wasn't to anyone necessarily in the audience, I hope to make people proud about the work that we do, and I think you've done a great job, Monterey, of both building a foundation of models for looking at to provide that foundation for water supply that we can then ask questions about water demand and future climate and so on. So the next slide is a little bit about PTSD. So apologies to Monterey before, but I want to tell a story. And probably a lot of people know a little bit about this story. Literally, and so to start with, just a couple papers on the left, like super cool science, looking at, building complex models about future climate supply in the province, and then asking the question, working with the ag sector in the province to say, are we at risk in the future with our current crops or some of the new crops that we're bringing into play? And, and the answer from doing this work was, if we're thinking about barley, both in the irrigated farmland and dryland farming in the central part of the province or further north, barley's not at risk to what we're looking at from a climate change scenario. So if we're thinking about risk management for the future, whether it's a government perspective from policy, farmers' perspective and how they're managing land and some of the infrastructure, barley's not one of those things that's going to require you to change when we're worrying about what is the future. And so lo and behold, communications at the University of Alberta puts big signs out saying, hey, be for your barley. And, of all the times that this comes out, it just happens to be the day Greta Thunberg lands in the province and has a climate protest in downtown Edmonton. And I'm not a big user of Twitter. I'm a twit when it comes to Twitter. But there was a twit storm because this was the U of A saying, being a climate-denying province, U of A was being a climate-denying institution, and why are we supporting climate-denying science? And nobody, as you all know, when there's a twit storm, actually goes back and tries to find primary sources of data. And so just to prove, I am a boomer. I'm the last year that boomers were actually born, but I'm a twit on Twitter, so I don't use it very often, but every once in a while I interject. So if you want to follow people on Twitter and you don't want to get too many things in your Twitter, then follow me. I think I've sent 3 notes in my lifetime on it. But the point that I made on Twitter was, too bad the billboard doesn't reflect the complex conclusions of the actual science, which speaks to water footprint, agriculture, and climate adaptation. And too bad everyone in this line of messaging, no one has actually gone and read the work that was done, because it's really cool work and it's got some really good messages, and it's got nothing to do with climate denying. So per Monterey, and her work is in the middle of this, and I'm sure came out of that with PTSD, but anyway, shout out to that work. And so the last project I was just going to highlight, this is one of these ones that's, I'm still not sure how many steps away it ever is from being applied to the irrigation sector from an agriculture perspective. But fellow on the left here, Cam Cote, fellow who worked in a aircraft, he was 3D printing aircraft landing parts, was interested about water. Made his own sprinkler system, worked with some computer scientists and figure out how to, basically, you can water a square, as a simple example. And so his sprinkler systems have now been deployed in fairly high-end areas. So there's a number of sports fields throughout North America, cricket fields and others where they've employed this. Not a single head is in the middle of the field, super safe for people that use it. All the water just lands on the field, because literally it will water a square. You can have 2 sprinklers come together and they never overlap again, because it's all programmed. The heads are GPSed. It works quite well. Here's just a picture of it spraying an area at a Palm Springs golf course. So there's a place that is being installed at a Palm Desert golf course right now. Doesn't water the bunkers, just waters the green. It's tied to a whole bunch of sensors. And so he's worked with these computer scientists as well to build some really cool analytics from a super easy to use interface. That's also got wind shift software on it. So at least when it's being tested here at the golf course, And Palm Desert has their 40 kilometer an hour, or I guess their 25 mile an hour winds. The whole system adjusts, so again, they're just watering the places that they want to water. So Cam's been doing some work, a little bit work with the Alberta agriculture system down here to say, is there any place for the sprinkler system to be sort of brought into the Alberta ag on the agriculture sector here. Still a little bit away. He has to figure out how to manufacture this with something other than aircraft landing aluminum parts, because that's a little bit too expensive for you. But last point, before I just say a concluding slide, reference something of interest, the Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network. It's also called CAIN, C-A-A-I-N. Recently funded by the federal government, about $47 million, I think it is. An equal plus amount of leverage from the industrial partners, the province. So Alberta Innovates is a partner in it. We're currently standing up a not-for-profit side agency to receive the money, and we'll be actually putting out some call for proposals soon. And so the focus there is smart farms, automation, robotics, data integration, analytics, sustainability, traceability. So the food supply chain, certainly irrigation, precision irrigation and precision agriculture components in here. And so this new funding opportunity will certainly be available in the very near future. I would anticipate sort of early in the government's next fiscal year that a call for proposals will go out. And if you have any questions on it, I can answer them. So last two slides, we have an annual Water Innovation Forum. Last year was May 22nd, 23rd. Changing the format a little bit, so we haven't specifically picked the day, but we're maybe just going to try to run it in one day and do the format a little bit differently this year. So probably have that sort of plan concluded next week. In ventures, so innovation, venture capital. If you haven't been to Calgary for this is the third year in Ventures is being run. There's like over 3,000 people have attended this from 36 countries. There's really three streams, one very much in particular that will be focused on agriculture and agri-food innovation, and then also data innovation and data analytics are some other streams that sort of have overlap and interest to this group here. And that's in early June. Just a couple last comments. Outcomes-focused investments. So, you know, line of sight, our investments have to somehow, you can look out the world and tell a story that we've changed the way Alberta operates a little bit. Partnerships are really important because we don't invest in anything unless there's an end user. Leverage is important, so we look to take our government dollars and multiply them. We've got two intake processes, open competition or continuous. You can come up and chat with me and I can indicate a way that we could potentially make an opportunity for an application. And the last point, we're in the process of just initiating a survey with stakeholders for new investment opportunities that will form a call for proposals in the future. And I'd like to say when I look back, I don't think we've funded enough in terms of connections to the ag and the irrigation sector. And I would suggest we've been a little bit too heavy on the municipal and the oil and gas, in particular the oil and gas. And I'd like to see more ag sector innovation that's supported through our water program. So with that, thanks, and enjoy the rest of the day.